Imagine this. You and your best friend embark on the exciting journey of starting a podcast. You are full of ideas, passion, and a shared vision. But as the podcast grows and evolves, so do the complexities. Who owns what? Who does what? How are the profits going to be split? Suddenly, the waters are murky, and what was once a fun venture becomes fraught with disagreements, minor at first, and then later maybe more significant. But can this be avoided? Well, absolutely. Learn how on this episode of Legit Podcast Pro, the cornerstone of your podcast legal and business affairs, the Podcast Prenup. Welcome back to Legit Podcast Pro. I'm Gordon Firemark, the podcast lawyer, and today we're pulling back the curtain on what I call a podcast prenup. Let's demystify this legal document, your lifeboat, and understand how it can protect your podcasting venture. In this episode, we're going to hone in on this crucial and often overlooked legal instrument. I call it a podcast prenup. It's sometimes also called a podcast co-production agreement. And if you've found yourself wondering what this is, why you need one, how to establish one, this is the place for that. I'm talking about a form of an agreement or a legal entity structure or something that protects you and your podcast by outlining the responsibilities, the rights, the relationships between the co-hosts or partners. And it's a fundamental tool that will ensure the smooth operation of your podcast venture. So whether you're just starting out on podcasting journey or you're a seasoned podcaster looking to level up on professionalism, this episode will guide you toward a more secure and harmonious and legally sound podcasting venture. This episode is brought to you by Easy Legal Forms and Templates for Podcasters. If you're a legit podcast pro, you want to protect your intellectual property and ensure that content is used appropriately. Easy Legal Forms and Templates for Podcasters can help. Our form store at podcastlawforms.com provides a variety of legal forms and templates specifically for podcasters, including host and co-host agreements, DMCA takedown notices, release forms, and much more. With these easy downloadable templates, you can customize the forms you need in just minutes. Plus, our affordable bundle and a la carte pricing makes it easy to get the protection you need without breaking the bank. Visit podcastlawforms.com today. Easy, legal, affordable forms and templates for podcasters. podcastlawforms.com. So let's kick things off by defining what we mean by a podcast prenup. Much like a prenuptial agreement between two people planning to get married, a podcast prenup is a written agreement between the co-hosts or producing partners. It's legally binding, a contract that outlines the responsibilities, rights, and relationships between them as relate to the podcast. The podcast prenup provides a clear blueprint for the governance and operation of your podcasting venture. It's the document that can keep you and your co-hosts on the same page and prevent misunderstanding, because it's about setting clear expectations from the get-go and having a clear framework to fall back on if disagreements arise. Lots of podcasters start off as friends or colleagues with a shared passion. They plunge into the world of podcasting without a lot of thought to the business implications of the venture. The prenup makes sure everyone involved understands that there is a business side to things and what their role is in that business side. Having a prenup is not a sign that you anticipate your podcast partnership's going to fail or that you distrust your co-hosts. I'd say it's a proactive professional step that helps to safeguard your podcast's future, demonstrates that you take your podcast seriously and are prepared to handle whatever comes your way. It's about preparing for all of the possible scenarios so your podcast can navigate those rough waters and continue to thrive. In essence, a podcast prenup is a safety net. It helps to ensure longevity and success of the show by providing a solid legal foundation. Think of your podcast as a ship, and then the prenup is the design blueprint that guides its construction and the chart that guides it on its voyage. Now, why would you need a podcast prenup, you might ask? Well, let's dive into some details. Like any venture involving multiple individuals, podcasts can have lots of challenges. Disputes over ownership, creative differences, disagreements about money, workload, timetables, you name it. They can occur at any stage. If you don't get out ahead of these things, they can not only disrupt the podcast's smooth operation, but they can also lead to its premature end. A podcast prenup is a tool that proactively addresses these potential issues. Having a written co-production agreement will just make it easier to resolve things if there are conflicts that arise. It's like having a roadmap when you're lost, guides you back onto path when things start to get complicated or scary. Ownership disputes are actually quite common in podcasting, especially when the podcast starts to really get popular or becomes monetized. As a lawyer, I'll tell you, this is one of the most common reasons podcasters reach out and hire me. Questions like who owns the name of the show, the content, the branding can become very contentious. A podcast prenup clearly defines these ownership rights, and that prevents potential battles down the line. Similarly, there are creative differences that are sort of inevitable in any artistic adventure you go on. No podcasting's no different. Disagreements might arise over the podcast direction, the content, the style, maybe the guest lineup, and a well-structured podcast prenup outlines the decision-making process, ensures that all the parties have a say, and that there's a system in place to resolve disagreements constructively. And they say that money is the root of all evil. And when it comes to podcast-related disputes, there's no doubt the sharing of costs and risks and the distribution of profits can definitely be a potential point of conflict, especially when the podcast starts to generate real money. Who gets what and how much? The prenup allows the co-hosts and co-producers to determine in advance how those profits and maybe losses will be shared so they don't wind up with big, nasty financial disagreements later. In essence, a podcast prenup is an invaluable asset that safeguards the harmony and longevity of your show, sets clear expectations, minimizes the potential for misunderstandings, and provides a solid foundation for resolving conflicts. Now, starting up a new creative project like a podcast, it is very easy to overlook the business and legal details. But having a prenup is a sign of foresight and professionalism and mutual respect among the co-hosts. So, now that we understand what a prenup is and why you need one, let's talk about the key elements that the document should include. The first critical thing is that ownership element. The document needs to address who owns the podcast and all of the associated intellectual property. It isn't just about the name and the show art or logo, but also about the content you produce, all those episodes. Are they collectively owned, or does one person retain rights to the show and the title and those kinds of things? How are those rights going to be exercised? And what happens if one party wants to leave or if the podcast disbands? These are critical questions that the ownership section of your podcast prenup should clearly answer so you can avoid potential conflicts. Your podcast prenup should also clearly outline the roles and responsibilities. This is beyond just who's responsible for what, but also detailing what exactly is expected from each person doing their duties. One person in charge of editing while the other is going to handle promotion. Who's responsible for scheduling guests? Who manages the finances? Getting all this stuff figured out early is how you ensure smooth operations and avoid conflicts. And then the money. Financial arrangements, definitely another key element you have to address. Now, it's no big deal when everybody's excited and getting started. But once the money starts flowing, whether that's in or out, things can get touchy among the team. This section should detail how expenses are handled, how profits and losses are distributed, and so on. Is everything shared equally, or is there a different arrangement? This is where clear understandings about money in writing will prevent a lot of disputes later on in the future. And then we come to resolving those disputes and disagreements that do come up. The fact is, no matter what you do, conflicts can and do arise. Your podcast prenup should have a clause that outlines how the conflicts will be resolved. Will you go to mediation or arbitration, or is there a decision-making structure that you could fall back on? Maybe you appoint a tiebreaker, someone that you both trust to make decisions when you can't agree. Now, this can help keep your podcast running smoothly even when you encounter bumps along the road. And lastly, the podcast prenup should address an exit strategy. In other words, it needs to outline what happens if a co-host decides to leave or if the podcast comes to its end. How are their shares in the podcast going to be handled? Can they start a competing podcast? It might seem pessimistic to be talking about these kinds of things at the very beginning, but it's really a crucial part of safeguarding the future of your show and your own efforts. A well-drafted podcast prenup should leave no room for ambiguity. It's this comprehensive document that covers all of these aspects of your venture, provides a solid, clear framework that can guide you on the podcasting journey. Now, I've prepared a handy-dandy free guide that can help you get on top of all the issues and plan for your podcast prenup. Just head on over to guide.podcastprenup.com. Now that we've covered the what and the why and what's in the document, let's tackle the final question. How do you go about establishing or getting it? Well, the best thing you can do is get a lawyer. Good, solid legal advice. Sometimes a well-constructed LLC and its operating agreement will stand in for a co-production agreement. But even then, oftentimes with LLCs, it's a good idea to have a separate, more focused agreement that covers the kinds of issues we're talking about here. Drafting a legally sound agreement that covers all the necessary bases isn't really something you should handle alone, especially if you're unfamiliar with legal jargon and contracts. An expert, a lawyer well-versed in intellectual property law and contracts can draft or review your agreement to make sure it's comprehensive enough and legally enforceable. Remember, not an area where you want to cut corners, because a poorly written agreement could create more problems than it solves. Now, hiring a lawyer does have a cost, but it might not be as high as you think. But the next best thing you can do, if you can't or just don't want to hire a lawyer, is use a legal form template from a reliable source, like what I've got over at our podcastlawforms.com site. Our podcast co-production agreement is designed to cover all the bases that you need in a podcast prenup, and my easy-to-follow video instructions will help you get things squared away fast and easy. Either way you decide to go, you're going to have an open, honest conversation, thorough communications with your co-hosts and partners. Sit down with the team, discuss the terms of the agreement. Cover everything from that division of rights and responsibilities, profit shares, ownership, decision-making process, dispute resolution. And remember, it isn't a one-sided document. Everybody needs to come to an understanding and agreement in order for it to be meaningful. Now, it's true, negotiating these terms might seem a little intimidating or uncomfortable, but I'll tell you, it is far better to get this stuff out in the open and on the table at the beginning of the relationship, when everybody's getting along and excited about the prospects and looking forward, because it's never going to get easier to get to an agreement than then. Now, this is a crucial part of establishing your podcast prenup. You have to negotiate the terms. Everyone's interests will want to be protected, and everyone needs to feel that they've received fair treatment. This is how you foster trust and understanding among the team. Create a stronger foundation for the show. So, explain what you want and expect. Be ready to hear the same from your colleagues. And it might be necessary to compromise a bit on some things. But as often as not, everyone's pretty close to things from the outset. You'll find you're closer to agreement than you think. Getting your podcast prenup involves working with a lawyer and or rock-solid templates, engaging in open communication with your co-hosts, and negotiating terms that are acceptable to all parties. Now, that may seem a little daunting, but remember, it's a proactive step that secures the future of the show. The old saying goes, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And in this case, a well-drafted podcast prenup could save you countless hours of stress and potential legal struggles and tons of money down the road. So as we wrap up this episode, I just want to recap. We've delved into the world of the podcast prenup, the co-production agreement. We understand what they are, why they're important, and what the key elements they should contain are. And we've explored how you can go about getting one with the help of legal advice, open communication and negotiation, and maybe a legal template from podcastlawforms.com. Remember, the podcast prenup isn't about anticipating failure or distrust among the co-hosts. It's that proactive step that ensures the smooth operation and success of the podcast venture long into the future. It's about being prepared for all scenarios, establishing a clear framework, and providing a roadmap for your podcast's journey. The realm of podcasting, very exciting and rewarding, but like any venture, it comes with its complexities and potential conflicts. As a podcaster, it's crucial to navigate these complexities with professionalism, foresight, and respect for our co-producers and co-hosts. This well-crafted podcast prenup is a big, important tool to help you do just that. So thank you for joining me on this journey today. As always, I'm Gordon Firemark, the podcast lawyer, reminding you to keep your passion burning bright. But remember, it's also always a good idea to protect that flame with a little legal fireproofing. Stay legal, stay profitable, and stay tuned for the next episode of Legit Podcast Pro.